Hello and welcome to Film Companion South. This is a show called Game of Theories where we discuss the phenomenon that is Game of Thrones. My name is Hriday Ranjan. Today we are going to be discussing Season 8 Episode 5. So if you haven't watched the episode, please go ahead and watch it. The makers had a unique problem with this particular episode because not only did they have to show the most hyped battle in the entire series, but they also had to use this one episode to completely flip one of the main protagonists and by the end of the episode make them an antagonist. So if you look at it from that point of view, the makers succeeded in this particular episode because by the end of the episode, you begin to question whether Daenerys is actually any different from Cersei. And you begin to ask yourself, were we supporting the wrong person all along? The episode takes its time in establishing Daenerys' descent into evil. And you can understand why, because her people don't love her the way they like Jon Snow. Her hand doesn't trust her methods, and Jon Snow won't reciprocate her feelings. Missandei is dead. In fact, the only person that Daenerys has left is Drogon, and it makes sense that she charges into battle with only Drogon by her side. The farewell scene between Tyrion and Jaime was kind of touching because it's kind of true. Jaime was the only guy who never looked at Tyrion like a monster. In fact, in the books, it's mentioned that Tyrion wanted to grow up and become somebody like Jaime, somebody who was good with a sword, somebody who was loved by their father, but that never really happens. The other thing to note is that Tyrion is very sure that King's Landing is going to fall the next day. He's probably seen the craziness in Daenerys' eyes, or he's probably read numerous stories of Targaryen kings with dragons who have destroyed entire cities. Having said that, it is sad that these two men will not be on screen together again because they had shared a wonderful chemistry and their scenes were all beautifully written. However, it is a sad ending. We are quickly taken into the battle. Now this battle is kind of unique because every battle in the Game of Thrones universe is shot at different locations. We have had battles by the sea, in battlegrounds, we have had them across the wall, but this one is an urban map. It takes place inside the city, so there are armies and houses and people and families and all these things to consider. We are quickly then thrown into the battle. Now it is a little disappointing that the makers did not have enough time to set up this battle properly. If you look at Game of Thrones battles, they are set up very beautifully. It always begins with a handicap. For example, you remember Jon in front of the Bolton army completely alone. Or if you remember in the last season, there was this time where they go across the wall and there are a group of fighters surrounded by a sea of White Walkers. Unfortunately, this time we didn't have much time to set up the battle scenes. And because of that, this battle should be called the Battle of Anticlimax. Now, one of the reasons why most viewers were disappointed was because the Iron Fleet was destroyed in one go, which was kind of shocking and surprising, but the makers did try to address this in a bit because in the beginning of the episode, it is mentioned that Daenerys was very clear on striking at the first light of day, which probably means that the Iron Fleet was unprepared because if you look at their ships, they were not in a battle-ready position. They were in no formation particularly. The other thing was their scorpions were not loaded, which probably means that she surprised them with their attack. That could only be the reasoning behind it. I for once thought that Drogon would be wearing some sort of a metal armor, because two of his brothers have died in the same way. So you would assume that Daenerys would take some sort of precautionary measure. However, probably it affects the aerodynamics and the flight and stuff like that. I don't know the science behind it. I'm a commerce student. The same goes for the Golden Company also. They were hyped up in 2 episodes and they were destroyed in one go. It was kind of ridiculous. And that is perhaps the destruction of the Iron Fleet and the Golden Company in a matter of few minutes is perhaps what led to major disappointment in this episode. It is interesting that whenever a new episode of Game of Thrones comes out, the first thing people are discussing are the deaths. In that sense, it's a true achievement for the show because it has taken something as gruesome as a death and elevated it to an art form. The deaths in this episode honestly were rather disappointing because most of them seemed rushed. And that is a problem I find in the TV show ever since it has gone past the source material of the books. Now, Euron Greyjoy's death didn't really affect me at all because Euron Greyjoy is a character who has never felt evil enough. Now, Game of Thrones has had great villains all through, whether it was Joffrey or it was Ramsay. But Euron Greyjoy never got the scope or the screen time to establish himself as the official evil, creepy villain of the show. Which is why even his death was utterly unconvincing and it seemed like it just brought down the pace of the entire episode. The only bit of fan service in this show was Clegane Bowl, the duel between the Mountain and the Hound. We for the first time get to see what sort of a zombie the Mountain has become thanks to Qyburn. I also love the bit where they both are going to fight and Cersei is like, hey, you know what, excuse me, let me just quickly leave the scene where you can solve it out among yourselves. It was a satisfying duel because that was the only way it could have ended, because if you look at the story of the mountain and the hound, it begins with the fire. So it is only fitting that that is how their story ends, in a huge heap of fire. In a matter of a few minutes, the Lannister army drops their weapons, the bell is rung, and that is when chaos ensues and Daenerys makes a heel turn. The remaining half of the episode is spent purely in sympathizing with Cersei and villainizing Daenerys. Cersei and Jaime's death was extremely disappointing. The death seemed to be not spectacular enough. It was also unconvincing how it was shown, because Cersei is not great with like army strategies and war plans. If anything, she is always one step ahead of her enemies. And if the show has earlier shown that she has hidden in Maegor's holdfast, it is unlikely that she will stand and wait for her entire city to burn. I think there was also the issue that a lot of fan theories suggested that it would be Jaime who would kill Cersei finally. And if the makers had stuck to that, people would have complained that it has become too predictable. I think in order to avoid that, they went in for a surprise ending. However, it seemed too bleak, too non-spectacular enough for the death of somebody like Cersei. Perhaps what the makers were going for was that the intimacy between Cersei and Jaime, because Cersei could only be her true honest self when she was alone with Jaime. Perhaps it was a throwback to that, it was a callback that finally it should end with just the two of them. However, it just seemed too unthought out and it was just too rushed. Now the only regret after watching the episode is that all the good actors on the show are now dead. The actors who played Cersei and Jaime and the Hound, or even Varys for that matter, were phenomenal actors who could pull off a complicated narrative arc. Unfortunately, now we are left with the main cast and they don't really match up when it comes to acting. The other disappointment for me was the music of this episode, because there was not enough time for the music to ripen and shine. The makers had to pack in so much into this one battle that there was no time for you to actually savor the moments that take place in the battle. Now there are a lot of predictions on what will happen in the next episode, because Daenerys might have won the battle, but Jon Snow, Tyrion Lannister and Arya Stark are against her. Tyrion, remember, could also be tried for treason because he let Jaime free. There is also a lot of discussion on who will finally sit on the Iron Throne. It could be Jon Snow or Arya or Daenerys, though I personally think it should be Tyrion Lannister. He is the perfect candidate. He is wise, he has ruled over people, he has led his army in battle. I personally think he should sit on the Iron Throne. Also remember that Bronn could make a comeback in the next episode, because he has been promised High Garden once the battle is over. So he might make a surprise appearance. It's interesting to see how things will all end in the last episode. Now the last episode also got mixed reviews, and that is kind of understandable, because whenever something becomes a global phenomenon, it is hard to please all the fans, because everybody has a version of their endings in their own heads. For example, if you remember the last book of Harry Potter series, or if you think about Breaking Bad, people were always going to be disappointed in the ending because it is different from what you imagine in their heads. In that sense, the only weapon that the makers had in this episode was the element of surprise, and unfortunately, even that didn't work out too well for them. That was our review of the penultimate episode of Game of Thrones. Remember, there is only one more episode left. After that, millions of people are going to wonder what they're going to do with their lives. Please let us know what you thought of our review. If you have any hate comments, please let me know. I'll pass them on to George R.R. Martin. My name is Hriday Ranjan. You're watching Game of Theories. Please subscribe to Film Companion South for more such videos.